Thank you for staying with us here on Joy News Desk. Now, the Vice President, Dr. Mohamed Bawumia, has described the government's flagship free senior high school program as the biggest social intervention initiative by any government in Ghana since independence. Speaking at the government town hall meeting in Kumasi to lay bare achievements of the Akufo-Addo-led government in 3 years, Dr. Bawumia revealed that due to the success of the policy, senior high school enrollment has tremendously increased by 69%. Leading to about 1.2 million students benefiting from the policy.
To allow access to the internet across public tertiary institutions and senior high schools, government has awarded the contract for the provision of free Wi-Fi to all senior high schools and tertiary institutions. The empirical evidence is very persuasive that the key to economic transformation is human capital, not natural resources. There are many countries with natural resources, but it hasn't helped them in any way. The evidence shows that what matters is human capital. This is why President Nana Akufo-Addo has placed an emphasis of making sure that every Ghanaian child, regardless of the financial circumstances of the parent, will have access to free high school education. This was the promise we made prior to the election in 2016. And it is a promise that we have fulfilled.
Well, the Public Interest and Accountability Committee, PIAC, says despite the gains recorded in the implementation of the free senior high school policy, some challenges remain outstanding. The independent statutory body, which is mandated to promote transparency and accountability in the management of petroleum revenues in Ghana, released its 2020 report Tuesday on the 2018-2019 free SHS monitoring, where it made its observations on the policy known. According to PIAC, the free senior high school policy has resulted in a timelier reporting of students to school compared to the period preceding free senior high school. PIAC also observed students no longer have to wait for school fees to be provided them before reporting to school. On the supply of textbooks for core subjects, PIAC said they were provided in adequate quantities, albeit late in some instances. My colleague Roland Walker has been speaking with Vice Chair of PIAC, Professor Akosua Dakwa.
Was the disbursement of funds. The funds weren't necessarily being disbursed on time, so we found that schools were having to rely on the non-free SHS students' funds to support the rest of the project until they got their funds. So that was one of them. The second was that PTAs had been suspended, and because PTAs have been suspended, the projects that they were doing have been abandoned. Third, there is insufficient infrastructure. So classrooms, beds, infirmaries across the country, they are not available in all of the schools in sufficient quantities, so that it's likely that when a child is sick in one school, there might be a bit of a challenge in handling it in some of the schools. There have also been, the cutoff points have been abolished, particularly in the deprived schools, so there are some children who are struggling. They are in the schools, but their background doesn't prepare them adequately for what secondary school education requires. There's also the fact that elective textbooks are not part of the free SHS. So the free SHS supplies the core textbooks, but not the elective textbooks. And parents aren't fully aware of that. So there's a bit of a challenge there because parents are having a difficulty understanding that part of the project. Yes.
So, all in all, if let's say a school doesn't have an infirmary or even an adequately stocked infirmary, so to speak, that puts the health of a few students or a number of students who may have some health complication, whether they are chronic or not, into some difficulty. And you observe that?
Yes. There was a school we visited. Actually, we showed up right on time. Wow. Because then there was a car available, so we could put the child who had had an asthma attack or was having an asthma attack in the car to find solutions to her problem. Now, ideally, I suppose if you have asthma, you should go to school with your own inhaler. But it's important that as best as we can, some basics are provided across the country. Or a system is put in place so that if the school doesn't have what it needs, when it needs it, there's a way of ensuring that they get what they need in the school. Putting money into our schools in terms of infrastructure, we have quite a ways to go. So in that respect, we can't say that the money has not been used effectively because there's quite a lot of need. There's a bed bug problem, for example, in some of our schools, right? So when the schools have wooden beds as opposed to metal beds, it increases the likelihood of bed bugs. So even a policy to change all the beds in all the schools from wooden beds to metal beds, that's a lot of money. Now you can say, but they have a bed. So spending the money on the metal bed is not a good use of money. But if your child came home with the bed bugs, you would appreciate the move from the wooden beds to the metal beds. So we have to keep this in perspective.
Well, we want to look critically at some of the concerns that PIAC raised in this statement that they released yesterday on the free senior high school. So, for instance, it talks about elective textbooks not covered under the policy. However, this has not been clearly communicated to parents by government, leading to a situation where some parents are refusing to take responsibility for the purchase of these textbooks for their wards. This situation, PIAC also says, is negatively impacting on the quality of teaching and learning in the schools. The absence of a textbook replacement scheme is also adding to the challenge to effective teaching and learning. On the issue of funding and budgetary allocations, PIAC says some schools experience delays in receipts of funds, sometimes transferred in tranches within or across terms. About 85% of the schools visited had to rely on the funds of the non-free senior high school student to cater for all streams of students until funds are disbursed from the free senior high school secretariat. And it says if this is not addressed, it will impact negatively on the running of the schools when the program runs full stream. There's also the point about infrastructure and equipment, where PIAC says majority of the schools visited had insufficient classrooms, beds, labs, and equipment. Also poor or inadequate staff quarters. Prevalence of bed bugs, and we heard Professor Akosua Dankwa talk about this. Also lack of infirmaries, and where they exist, there are no qualified nurses to man these facilities. A case in point, according to the release, was when the PIAC team arrived just in time to save a student who had just had an asthma attack in one of the schools with no infirmary and no vehicle to convey the student to a health facility. Fast forward, they talk about key recommendations, and I want us to look at recommendations 4 to 6. So 4 says the committee strongly recommends full transparency in the delivery of supplies to the schools, and in particular, the buffer stock company must ensure that all goods supplied are accompanied by advice on the value and quantity of the goods. Also, cut-off grades for admitting students should be restored, as students with poor grades struggle with subjects during the course of the term. The Ghana Education Service should pay more attention to the basic schools to improve the quality of students for the second cycle schools. And finally, on point 6 of the recommendation, it says government must ensure that disbursements to the schools are done expeditiously as the non-free senior high school student phase out, to avoid closure of the schools and disruptions to the academic calendar. So this is all contained in this release yesterday. Free senior high school, generally it also says has improved access, but substantial challenges remain. So there you have it, the findings from PIAC's 2018-2019 free senior high school monitoring.